Welcome to Indefinable Magic. Observations and opinions provoked by a word, thought, or occurrence in an instalment of a TV show that's impacted the world far more than anyone might reasonably have expected. Written and presented by me, Toby Haydock. In these bite-sized editions, the observations and opinions will be provoked by a single watch of Doctor Who's very latest episode. Tonight's instalment of Indefinable Magic Bite Size, After Boom, written by Stephen Moffat, is called More Than Just Words. Faith, the magic word that keeps you never having to think for yourself. Ah, Doctor Who, that clever anti-establishment programme that is always about rationality over religion, data over divinity, knowledge over superstition, science, not sorcery, Miss Hawthorne. So faith, then, surely that has no place in the show. Blind belief without anything to back it up. Our hero performs no prayer, appeals to no higher power. The Doctor defeats with wisdom and wires, not incantations and invocations. Doctor Who is a show not about gods, but monsters. Or is it? Boom, I think, gives us a clue that Doctor Who's relationship with faith is rather more complex than we might think. Now, listen, there is a programme to be made about Doctor Who and religion, but this isn't it. I'm looking at Boom through the prism of faith, so I won't be getting into the specificities of the virtues and vices, contradictions and complexities, helpfulness and hypocrisies of Christianity or Islam or whatever your particular favourite or most hated religion might be. And I'm also more interested in looking at the various ideas that the latest episode of Doctor Who provokes, rather than indulging in any takedowns. I'm not reviewing or critiquing. It's rumination, not recrimination, Miss Hawthorne. Consideration, not criticism. Now, at first sight, it seems that in Boom, our wise hero, the Doctor, is tearing down yet another petty human foible. Aren't we silly for believing in the impossible? Our gullible need for salvation easily exploited by alien capitalists. But just because the writer put those words, about faith stopping us from thinking, into the mouth of our hero, I'm not sure we should assume that that is what he thinks. And indeed, Stephen Moffat ends the episode by having the Doctor telling Splice to keep the faith. Moffat may well pepper his scripts with a cynical turn of phrase and whip-smart aphorisms, but I think he's a sentimentalist at heart. The very solution to the problem in Boom is the human spirit persisting even after death. Now that's hugely unscientific and uncynical. It's an optimistic belief that whatever it is that we are persists after the destruction of the biological entity that is our physical form. It speaks of a soul or a spirit, and you won't find either of those in any scientific textbooks, but they are there in the Bible, the Quran, and the Vedas. Indeed, key to any faith is the belief in some form of life after death, a concept that features more in Moffat scripts than any other. Everybody lives in the Doctor dances. The silence in the library is broken by the sound of all the characters who died therein living on in a computer program. And a beloved companion can't die under his watch without being brought back to life and ascending to the stars to continue existence on a higher plane, often with a space lesbian thrown in for good measure, should we think that Mr. Moffat is getting too stuffily religious. As with Moffat's various happy ending afterlives, including the one in Boom, in which Vater's spirit lives on beyond the purely mechanical capturing his likeness and personality in the post-death AI simulant, is there to take the sting of death away, just like Faith does. As Splice says about her mother being gathered up, a euphemism to soften the blow of loss, Moffat's stories often end with an optimistic view of death. Our loved ones aren't truly gone. And like dramas with happy endings, faith helps us to accustom ourselves to loss. That is what it's for. You tell kids that their dead hamster has gone to a better place because you don't want them to be sad. And as we grow up, those hamsters become parents, friends, loved ones. It's easier to wave someone off on a journey that you'll join them on later on than it is to consign them to darkness forever. In real life, we have no proof of life after death. The dead live in our hearts and memories, but any atheists amongst us know, deep down, that the actual person is gone, no matter how much we might cherish their memories. As Ruby Sunday says in Boom, he's gone. He's really actually dead. But for a person of faith, the promise of eternal life, of our spirits ascending and our being reunited with a lost loved one, well, that's part of the whole bag. And the fact that this has never been proved is fundamentally what faith is all about. The likes of Richard Dawkins off of Army of Ghosts made great capital of dismissing such optimism as foolishness, although I'm often amused by the messianic zeal of his acolytes, oxymoronically righteous in their agnosticism. Religion is obviously a social construct, and one used as a form of control or an excuse for evil, they say. Yep, sure. I'm totally on board with that. As cynical old Chris Boucher writes in The Face of Evil, tellingly, originally called The Day That God Went Mad, when Neva the shaman says, we start getting proof and we stop believing, rational, doubting, Thomas replies, with proof, we don't have to believe. As the dictionary says, faith is a strong belief in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. And yet, as I get older, I find faithlessness, rather like cynicism, an overrated currency. Yeah, I get that you think everything is down to earth and factual, but I quite like there to be magic in the world after all, Joe. That's not to say I'm a believer. I'm not. But I actually think that sometimes a lack of faith has been a hindrance to me to a contented life. Where some might turn to the Holy Spirit in times of great sadness or uncertainty, I've turned to the 40% proof one, and I know now which is healthier. And I actually think, and this is more necessary in today's society than ever, that to be subservient to a higher power keeps one's ego in check. It's harder to be narcissistic when trying to adhere to the doctrines of a super being who won't show themselves to you until after you've departed this earthly realm. That requires a level of trust that takes a lot of self-discipline and personal sacrifice. And yet, I've always prided myself in being far too sensible for that sort of thing. My rationality has always allowed me to give faith a drubbing, which is maybe why I've always liked Doctor Who, where gods are false and explanations, even if nonsensical, at least make a stab at sounding scientifically plausible. I don't know how you reverse polarities or cross dimensions or locate etheric beams, or perhaps locate beams etherically, I don't know, but it all sounds more plausible to me than invoking the spirit of Isis, conjuring a healing spell, or praying to the gods of defeating alien invaders. I definitely think of Doctor Who as a show where the scientific method is the correct one. Psychotronics, Doctor? No, electronics. On this subject, I'm definitely with the haters. Growing up in the 1980s, I was very much of the opinion that blind faith was the act of a sheep, an unthinking zealot. But in the 80s, this was easy, because it felt like rebellion, because it seemed to me that a lot of people used their faith to reinforce or impose their prejudices upon the rest of us, that there was an hypocrisy in the message. People didn't practice what they preached. How could anyone in their right mind be faithful to any creed that did that? But now, I don't know. I envy and admire faith in others. It takes effort of the will and a certain selflessness. It's a complicated thing. Doctor Who's most beautiful and nuanced depiction of faith is, I think, in Gridlock, a story about people trapped on a highway. The action breaks for a beautiful broadcast of a hymn, the old rugged cross, crackling out of the speakers to each group of travellers trapped in their individual cars, cut off from each other bar contact by CB radio. For a brief moment of shared ritual, the community comes together for a moment of quiet reflection and of togetherness. And it's a ritual using music. Faith is often enacted using practices that are good for us emotionally, uplifting hymns, spoken prayers, declamatory oratory, calm contemplation, meditative self-reflection. And yet, that comfort, the community, that coming together in gridlock, also speaks of a people who are ossified, who, their religion tells them, are all right so long as they are together and faithful, and yet they're permanently trapped on a motorway going nowhere, whilst giant crabs pick them off from beneath. Possessed of true human spirit, they should be striving, fighting, questioning the status quo, but their religion comforts them to the point of apathy. It's their opiate. So faith in this story, very cleverly, represents both the cell and its padding. It keeps people safe, but imprisoned. But if a prisoner doesn't know they're a prisoner, are they happy? Oh. Russell T. Davies is a kind and empathic enough writer not to portray the contradictions of faith using the lazy, cruel jibes of an atheist. He understands that faith can be a force for both good and bad, sometimes at exactly the same time. Indeed, he has written probably the most religious sequence in Doctor Who of all time, where the world's faith in the Doctor is harnessed and amplified by the Archangel network. Archangel, I'll say that again for those at the back. To transmogrify Dobby the House Doctor into the second coming of David Tennant. Resurrected, bathed in golden light and fretted with golden fire, this Doctor floats through the air and disarms his enemy with love, with the power of forgiveness, the one thing the Master has no defence against. It's a conclusion steeped in religious symbolism and phraseology, in which the power of prayer, for once, replaces the reversed polarity or the neutron flows. It's an ending, if I'm honest, that's a bit too religious for me. I told you, I prefer something that at least pretends to be scientific. That said, I like my Doctor Who to be political, so Boom's message that war is often driven by economics is one that resonates. That brilliant moment in Schindler's List, when the protagonist, who has not yet had his own Damascene conversion, gleefully declares how good war is for business, is a moment of huge and clever complexity that echoes in this week's Doctor Who. And in today's landscape, in which religious institutions are sometimes known to invest in arms firms, the murkiness of the morality of modern faith institutions is definitely worth examining in our favourite show. If it's a toss-up between boom or bust, it seems, the Church doesn't want to go bust. But because the institutions are flawed, that doesn't mean that people who quietly practice their own faith don't have a right to feel unfairly maligned by the Doctor's disparaging comments. But then, just because the Doctor said what he said out loud, does that mean that the series itself has a downer on faith? I'm not so sure. The Curse of Fenric is a story with horror and cool monsters that also muses on the conflicting nature of faith. Reverend Wainwright has lost his, appalled at the moral compromises of war, which involves bombing innocent children. The story, brilliantly, doesn't judge him for this, but it does punish him. Had he kept his faith, he'd have survived the adventure. The faith, it would have shielded him. Instead, he's a broken man with no defence against the forces of darkness. The Doctor's faith, on the other hand, in his companions, protects him from a blood-sucking death. Faith, then, is a good thing, even though to retain his, Wainwright would have had to have gone through a certain mental moral compromise, to have accepted the death of innocents for the greater good. We call that hypocrisy these days. Or is it pragmatism? Ooh, there's the rub. Even as early as the William Hartnell story, The Aztecs, the concept of faith is dealt with great thought and nuance. In fact, our heroes use faith as a weapon. The good guy, Ortlock, has faith in Barbara being the resurrection of the god Yetaxa, whilst the bad guy, Sir Toxel, does not, But the thing is, Toxel is right. He's correct. Barbara is a false goddess. And in order for the goodies to win, they have to dupe the good man in order to outfox the bad one. I beg of you, do not deceive me or prove false to me, implores Ortlock. But she does, and is, and his faith is broken. Now this is termed at the end of the story as a kind of victory. Ortlock has lost his faith, but found a better one, says the Doctor. Well, that might all be very well on an intellectual level and from a 20th century Western perspective, but essentially everything the benign and decent Ortlock loved and believed is destroyed, and he ends up a broken man in the wilderness. It's a bit rich for the Doctor to say that, from the comfort of his own TARDIS, Ortlock is better off. Because Ortlock hasn't just had his mind changed. The core of his whole being has been destroyed. Because faith is, surely, more than just a feeling, no matter how we atheists might characterise it. To insult someone's faith is, somehow, worse than contradicting their opinion or insulting their clothes or looks. And in these times of being more sensitive, rightly so, to racial and gender-based discrimination, why then do we turn around and say that an old sacred cow, someone's faith, is fair game? With professed Christianity on the decrease in this country, are we not in danger of punching down where once we satirised the dominant institution? And, to be fair, I'd have sympathy with any Christians offended by Saturday's instalment who'd, I think fairly, point out that the BBC wouldn't be quite so happy to house content that satirised any other religion. But then, as I say, I'm more inclined to think that the script is being more circumspect and even-handed than some of the Doctor's outbursts might initially suggest, so I hope nobody is really offended at all. But, faith is a sensitive subject. I mean, I love Doctor Who, and I have followed it religiously since I was a kid, and I create it in my own image. I believe in fairness and curiosity and empathy and all the positives I see in the character of the Doctor, but I know other people interpret the show differently. It's about somebody who goes into space and blows up people who are bad. But Doctor Who is not the equivalent of a religion, because I know it is not real. And I don't think that any of my actions or prejudices are acceptable just because I saw them in the show or interpreted that the Doctor did something like them once. But then again, it means I can never be let off if my own actions are bad. I don't have any excuse. I have to own them. And we know how thin it sounds when someone says, "God told me to do it," in order to justify their heinousness. This week's rumination on the nature of faith came via a challenging new way of telling a Doctor Who story, having our busy, bustling, physical hero glued to the spot for most of the running, or not, time. As with when he produced one of the most popular and famous Doctor Who stories ever, Blink, for which he had the leading characters for only a small percentage of screen time and yet still produced a classic, Stephen Moffat was working against various limitations. A test, no less. A test of metal, spirit, of faith in an idea. And such tests often bring out the best. But of course, even religious faith is based on an interpretation of a text. And that can go in all sorts of directions, depending on the interpreter, which is why there are arguments about the real meanings of various passages and preachings in all religions. And I interpreted a metaphor in that face-off between Mundy and the Doctor, the Anglican priest against a massive explosion, religion versus a big bang, God versus science. The Anglican Marines seem at first like a typical Doctor Who juxtaposition, a show that is often bedecked with militarism. To introduce holy soldiers seemed like a nice twist in the time of Angels, Flesh and Stone. I enjoyed their novelty in that story, particularly Ian Glenn's dignified Father Octavian, whose reverent nature failed to disguise his contempt for the Doctor. That was a great dynamic, with our reckless, heathen hero seen through the eyes of our honourable, respectful and brave guest protagonist with disdain. But I saw the ordained troopers in a new light this time around, drawn by that smart observation in the script that crusading warriors are by no means new and that historically battle is steeped in religion. I mean, the Crusaders. Even though to 21st century Western viewers, gun-toting priests might seem paradoxical, like canonized napalm, sanctified mustard gas, or indeed the holy hand grenade of Antioch. The juxtaposition is, of course, the irony, but it also adds an element of braveness to our warriors, who have a conviction on a spiritual scale rather than just being, say, conscripted grunts. They are on a moral crusade, a mission from God. Boom also had what looked to be certain Stephen Moffat tropes, taking something familiar and turning it into something horrific. Fog monsters? Mud monsters? We know he'd probably do something fiendish and scary with either of those. So far, so Moffat. But it was actually a clever twist that the threat was ultimately neither. But witty dialogue? Check. Kid and father? Check. Lead actor mispronouncing an established place name by repeated weird emphasis on its second syllable? Check. I mean, after Villengard and Metebelis, what next? Jupiter? Androzyne? Miltonkines? Malfunctioning medical equipment? Check. I mean, the latter's becoming such a Moffat trademark, it does make me wonder if he was once goosed by an ECG machine, or barged into by a defibrillator, or cuckolded by a machine that goes ping. Anyway, it gives us some fabulous, clever lines. Life is cheap, patients are expensive. War is a business, and business is booming. This is great stuff. And in the Moffat tradition of taking an innocuous phrase and giving it an horrific or witty new meaning, such as the gift line in Deep Breath or I'm not winding you up in The Girl in the Fireplace, but his work is littered with such ingenious wordplay. His invocation of thoughts and prayers seemed not, to me, like a critique of religion. It was more a skewing of an everyday phrase in order to weaponize its emptiness for all its well-meaning intent. Taking that trite aphorism used in times of sadness and making it scary in the same way that he does with statues or gas masks or cracks in the wall. Eventually, though, in Boom, Mundy puts her faith in the Doctor. And when she does, the story heads towards its resolution, with salvation being dispensed by someone, the late John Francis Vater, who now has eternal, kinder life. It's not cynical at all. The ending is pretty sentimental, actually, because for all the satire and ribbing and death and destruction, Doctor Who is a show that fundamentally celebrates the best in human nature. Our rational show, which rejects magic solutions and would never have any of your actual deuses coming ex its machinas, is often actually about faith. It's about the fat kid in class saving the day by blowing up the school, about the cowardly alien agent or double-crosser or quisling coming good, about the bad person achieving redemption by sacrificing themselves for the greater good, and about trusting a mysterious outsider who encourages us to be better. Yes, that's it. Doctor Who is pretty much always about the day being saved by an otherworldly being who looks like us, but who speaks with great wisdom, who acquires loyal followers despite the antipathy and mistrust of the ruling elite, and who descends from the heavens to save us all. And in the end, it's about our capacity for goodness and overcoming the odds, defeating the science of probability, and facing that danger. Facing that danger and knowing that there's something within us that will enable us to conquer our fears. It's about having faith in human nature. So it's not about skepticism, actually. It's about trust, conviction, even optimism. It's about sympathy, not cynicism, Miss Hawthorne. Thanks for listening to Indefinable Magic. This week's episode was More Than Just Words, after Boom, which was written and presented by me, Toby Haydock. The podcast artwork is by Dylan Patterson, and the music was specially composed by Dominic Glynn. I'm grateful to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Darren Rule, John Rumfitt, Gavin Rymil, Tom Solinsky, Nick Salmond, Edward Salt, Samuel, no surname, Frank Shales, Christopher Sharp, Jack Sharp, John Sheehan, Scott Sherritt, Gavin Skinner, Darcy Smart, Dale Smith, David Smith, Giles Smith, Trevor Smith, Richard Smith, Andrew Snedden, David Spencer, Matthew Speddings, Joey Stephen, David Spofford, Chris Stokes, Adam Stone, Mark Swan, Dr. Gary Thomas, Richard Thomas, Jason Thompson, Sabrina Tirabassi, David Trainier, Sidney Truitt, Jim Trenowden, Fanman Sang, John Turner, Lee Wakerley, Gary Wales, Jeff Walker, Steve Walker, Alistair Wallace, Craig Wallace, Gavin Ware, Peter Ware, Stephen Waters, Kevin West, Rich Wiggins, David James Wilson, Chris Williams, Mr. Withit, Stephen Witkowski, Lee Wood, David Workman, and Mark Wright. If you would like to hear your name read out like that, then you can become a patron at patreon.com/Toby Haydock, where for as little as £3 a month you get advance releases, bonus material, special monthly AMAs, and your very own exclusive podcast, as well as behind-the-scenes peeks at various of my Doctor Who related shenanigans. That's at patreon.com/Toby Haydock. As I say, the tiers start from £3 a month, but you can go up the tiers. But whichever tier you are on, you can get a 10% discount if you join for a year in one go. If you don't want to commit yourself to anything like that, you can do the occasional one-off donation if you would like by going to ko-fi.com/Toby Haydock, where you can pretend to buy me a coffee if you've particularly liked a podcast or I sound particularly poor or hungry. If you don't have the ability or inclination to contribute financially, and I totally get that, you can do something that costs you nothing, and that's to go to Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, and give these a 5-star rating and a few lines of review. I've also just migrated all of these podcasts onto YouTube, where you can watch them just with a placeholder logo, but any subscription to my Toby Haydock YouTube channel and any thumbs up and views and anything like that is, of course, always helpful in terms of my cyberspace algorithms, and I want my cyberspace algorithms to be well sexy. I'm also on social media at Toby Haydock for my own personal Twitter feed, at Haydock Podcasts for a feed dedicated to these things. There's also my Instagram account at toby.haydock, and I have a Facebook page as well. And I've got a website at Toby. I'm like Omega. I have no physical form. I exist purely through the power of my various internet pages. So that's the best place to get a hold of me. And as a postscript, here is a message from a correspondent on my Patreon, Joe Llewellyn, a frequent and welcome correspondent from across the pond from me, and offers a very interesting perspective on all of this. Here is the TLDL, says Joe. I had to look that up. Loved Boom, best of the RTD2 era, and I've been pretty happy with it so far. Boom really spoke to me as both a practicing Christian and a war veteran. And now the longer. Great episode. I'm a huge Moffat fan, but I was worried because I've had issues with how he portrays soldiers and the church, small c, in the past. But he's done great work with these subjects as well. Angel two-parter in Series 5. Joe actually chose that as his story for Happy Times and Places, so do check that out. I thought he handled both subjects this week with honesty and sensitivity. My view on war took a pretty radical shift after April 2021, so I completely agree with his hit on the military-industrial complex. Very gripping episode. I felt my chest tighten up toward the end. Fantastic performances all round. I'm not sure how morale would work if you knew that your side would kill you if you got too injured. Part of a soldier's motivation is the faith, there's that word again, that his buddies, his team, his command would move heaven and earth to save him if injured or captured, or would recover his body if killed. But this is sci-fi metaphor time, so I shouldn't overthink it. And as a retired combat engineer, I have views on the strategic and tactical use of mines in mobility/counter-mobility, but I've gone on long enough. Not at all, Joe. That was a really interesting insight, which I hope is a bonus for those of you who've listened to the end. I'm always pleased to receive a message from Joe. I like to hear perspectives from people with different life experiences from me. And that is what these podcasts are all about. As somebody said, hopefully shedding a different light on an episode and helping you to enjoy it or receive it in a different way. And anyway, hope that's what we've done here.